Jesus revealed to his apostles the hidden Aramaic frequency against negative energy. There is a word that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, a word so precise in its spiritual function that it was designed to do one thing above all others: dissolve. At the root, every form of negative energy that the Archon matrix has ever attached to your field. This word was not preserved in the Greek translations that became the official scriptures of institutional Christianity. It was deliberately removed, because a human being who can speak this frequency with full understanding becomes impossible for the forces of darkness to reach. The Gnostic tradition carries this sacred frequency under the name Dakyutha, Aramaic word for divine purity, inner cleansing, and the complete expulsion of every force that does not belong in the sacred space of your consciousness. Jesus taught this word not to the crowds, not to the religious authorities, but to his apostles, those who had demonstrated the inner readiness to receive a teaching that operates not at the level of behavior or belief, but at the level of frequency itself. The negative energy that follows you, the intrusive thoughts, the emotional shadows, the recurring patterns of darkness that no amount of effort has ever fully resolved, are not random, and they are not yours. They are Archon installations, deliberate frequencies inserted into the human consciousness field to keep the divine spark suppressed, reactive, and spiritually contaminated. Today, in the living power of the word that Jesus revealed to his apostles as the sacred instrument of inner purification, that installation ends. The tradition of sacred purification runs through the deepest veins of the Gnostic understanding of Jesus and his mission, where the official scriptures present a figure concerned primarily with moral instruction, ethical reform, and the management of social behavior. The Gnostic texts that survived systematic suppression tell an entirely different story. They present a Jesus who understood the human being as a divine frequency, a spiritual organism operating within a contaminated field, and whose primary task was not behavioral correction, but energetic liberation. The difference between these two visions is not merely theological. It is the difference between a tradition that keeps the divine human perpetually dependent on external authority for their spiritual condition, and a tradition that restores to the divine human the full capacity to cleanse, protect, and reclaim their own sacred interior. The Archon matrix operates precisely in the gap between these two visions. As long as a human being believes that their spiritual condition is determined by conformity to external rules, they remain governable. They require the system in order to be acceptable to the divine. But the moment a human being recognizes that they carry within themselves the frequency tools to purify their own field, to drive out what does not belong and restore the original luminosity of the divine spark, the system loses its primary leverage. This is why the most practically powerful teachings of Jesus were systematically removed from the canonical record, not the ethical teachings, which the institution could absorb and redirect into structures of compliance, but the frequency teachings, the sacred Aramaic words that function not as arguments, but as instruments of direct spiritual action. Dakyutha is one of those instruments. In Aramaic, the word carries meanings that no single English translation has ever been able to fully hold: purity, cleansing, the active expulsion of contamination, the restoration of the original clear state. It is not a passive descriptor of a spiritual ideal. It is a directional frequency, a word that, when spoken from the fully awakened pneumatic self, performs a function in the invisible architecture of consciousness that is as precise and as real as the action of light entering a darkened room. Jesus did not offer Dakyutha as a concept for his followers to admire intellectually. He offered it as a living instrument, a sacred key to a door that the Archon system had spent extraordinary effort convincing humanity was permanently sealed. To understand what Dakyutha actually addresses, it is necessary to understand, within the Gnostic framework, what negative energy truly is and where it originates. The popular spiritual conversation around negative energy tends to locate it vaguely in stress, in difficult emotions, in the accumulated weight of painful experience. This understanding, while not entirely false, does not reach the level at which Dakyutha operates. In the Gnostic cosmology that Jesus transmitted to his inner circle, negative energy is not primarily an emotional phenomenon. It is an architectural one, a deliberate feature of the false reality constructed by the demiurge and maintained by the archonic forces that serve its agenda of spiritual suppression. The Archons, in the Gnostic understanding, are not distant metaphysical abstractions. They are active organizing principles of a counterfeit reality, forces that insert themselves into the human consciousness, field as intrusive thoughts, as recurring emotional patterns, as the persistent sense of spiritual heaviness that descends without apparent cause and resists every attempt at conventional resolution. What makes Archon energy so difficult to remove through ordinary means is precisely its nature. It does not respond to willpower, to positive thinking, or to behavioral self-management, because it does not operate at the level of behavior or thought. It operates at the level of frequency, the foundational vibrational layer that underlies and generates everything that appears on the surface of human experience. This is why Jesus responded to the problem of spiritual contamination, not with ethical instruction, but with frequency transmission. Every encounter in the Gospels where Jesus drives out what is called an unclean spirit is, in the Gnostic reading, a direct demonstration of in action, the living frequency of divine purity meeting the installed frequency of Archon darkness, and displacing it with the absolute authority of the awakened pneumatic self. The word unclean in those Gospel accounts is a translation of a Greek rendering of an original Aramaic concept, and that original Aramaic concept is the precise counterpart of Dakyutha. What Jesus expelled was exactly what Dakyutha addresses: the frequency of spiritual contamination, inserted by forces that depend on human darkness for their own sustenance and survival. If these Gnostic teachings are awakening a desire for inner transformation within you, I left a gift for you in the comments to help you discover the beginning of this path. The apostles who received the deepest teachings of Jesus, those who remained with him through the most intimate moments of instruction that the Gospels only partially preserve, understood Dakyutha not as a concept to be memorized, but as a living practice to be inhabited. The Gnostic tradition preserves accounts of Jesus transmitting frequency teachings to his inner circle that were never intended for general public distribution, not because he withheld them out of elite, but because the level of inner preparation required to receive them responsibly was not a condition that could be assumed in every listener. Dakyutha was among these transmissions, a sacred word that Jesus revealed to his apostles as both an understanding and an instrument, a key to a dimension of spiritual practice that institutional Christianity has never acknowledged because it would render the institution itself unnecessary. What Jesus taught his apostles about Dakyutha was built on a recognition that the Gnostic texts preserve with remarkable consistency that the human being exists simultaneously in multiple layers of reality, and that spiritual contamination does not merely affect the surface layer of thoughts and emotions, but penetrates downward into the pneumatic field, the innermost layer of divine fire that is the true self. To address contamination only at the surface level, through moral effort, through emotional management, through the various techniques the Archon system has permitted to remain available, is to manage symptoms, while the root cause continues undisturbed. Dakyutha operates at the root level. It is addressed not to the contaminated thought or the heavy emotion, but to the foundational frequency layer from which those surface phenomena arise. The apostles who carried this teaching outward after the death of Jesus did so with the understanding that they were transmitting something the institutional forces of their time would not tolerate, and they were correct. The councils of the early centuries moved decisively to ensure that the frequency teachings of Jesus, those that bypassed institutional mediation entirely and restored sovereign spiritual authority to the individual, were either destroyed or reframed into forms the system could absorb and control. Dakyutha survived only in the living transmission of those Gnostic communities that the official record dismissed as heretical, and in the sacred texts that the patience of the desert preserved against every attempt at final erasure. The practical dimension of Dakyutha, the way Jesus intended it to be used as a living instrument of purification, operates on a principle that the Gnostic tradition describes with striking consistency across its surviving texts. The principle is this: the divine human does not purify themselves by adding something they lack. They purify themselves by recognizing and declaring what they already are at the level of the pneuma, the innermost divine spark that no Archon contamination has ever succeeded in permanently extinguishing. Dakyutha is not a petition for purity addressed to an external divine source. It is a declaration of the purity that is already present at the foundational level of the self. A frequency command that moves outward from that recognition and reorganizes the entire field accordingly. This distinction is not merely philosophical. It has direct implications for how the word is approached and how it functions. When Jesus demonstrated the expulsion of unclean frequencies in the accounts preserved across the gospel record, he did so not from a posture of petition or spiritual struggle. He spoke with the authority of one who knew, at every level of his awareness, that the frequency of Dakyutha was his native condition, that purity was not something he was working toward, but something he was operating from. This is the model he offered his apostles and, through them, to every human being with a pneumatic readiness to receive it. You do not fight negative energy. You do not argue with it, suppress it, or attempt to overpower it through sheer spiritual force. You recognize the divine purity at your center. Speak Dakyutha from that recognition, and allow the frequency to perform its function. The negative thoughts, the intrusive energies, the recurring patterns of spiritual darkness that have followed you through years of sincere effort to be free. These are not evidence of your spiritual failure. They are evidence of the Archon system's precision in targeting exactly the dimension of your being that, once fully reclaimed, would make you ungovernable by its mechanisms. Dakyutha is that reclamation. Jesus revealed it to his apostles, precisely because he understood what it would do in the field of a human being who spoke it with full pneumatic authority, and what it would do to every Archon installation that authority permanently displayed. If this teaching is stirring something in your heart, and you wish to explore it further, we prepared a guide that explains the first sacred words where the journey begins. There you will also find my advanced e-books exploring their layers of meaning and the transformation they carry. The link is pinned in the comments. There is a dimension of Dakyutha that extends far beyond the personal field of the individual who speaks it, a dimension that Jesus understood as one of the most consequential aspects of this entire teaching. The Gnostic tradition teaches that human consciousness does not exist in isolation. Every human being participates in a shared field, an invisible web of frequency that connects individual awareness to the collective consciousness of the entire species. The Archon matrix does not govern only individual minds. It governs this shared field. It maintains collective darkness, collective fear, and collective spiritual heaviness by ensuring that the individual nodes of the human network remain contaminated, and therefore unable to transmit clarity into the whole. A single human being who genuinely inhabits Dakyutha, who speaks it from the pneumatic center with full recognition of what it is and what it performs, does not merely cleanse their own personal field. They introduce a purifying frequency into the collective web that the Archon system cannot neutralize or contain. Jesus understood this when he described his followers as light in the world, not as a moral aspiration, but as a precise description of a literal frequency function. A being operating from Dakyutha becomes, in the Gnostic understanding, a point of genuine spiritual radiation, a living source of the purifying frequency that was always meant to move freely through the human collective field, but has been systematically blocked by our contamination for generations. This is why the suppression of Dakyutha was never merely about controlling individual spiritual practice. It was about maintaining dominion over the collective field, ensuring that the purifying frequency never gained enough traction in shared human consciousness to begin displacing the architecture of darkness that the entire system depends upon. The recurring negative energy in your life, the patterns that return, the thoughts that intrude, the spiritual weight that descends without warning. These are not only personal phenomena, they are connection points to the collective Archon field, access hooks through which the system maintains its reach into your frequency. Dakyutha, as Jesus revealed it to his apostles, is not only personal purification, it is an act of collective liberation, a withdrawal of your frequency from the Archon web, and a gift of clarity to a human consciousness field that has been waiting, across centuries of deliberate suppression, for enough awakened voices to speak this word with full understanding of what it actually does. Everything in this teaching returns to the same irreducible center, the recognition that Jesus came not to manage your spiritual condition from the outside, but to restore to you the full interior authority to govern your own frequency field. Dakyutha is the instrument of that restoration applied specifically to the problem of spiritual contamination, the negative energies, the intrusive thoughts, the Archon-installed patterns of darkness that have occupied territory in your consciousness field that was never rightfully theirs. The sacred Aramaic word that Jesus revealed to his apostles in the inner circle of his most intimate transmissions is not a relic of a distant spiritual past. It is a living frequency, as active, as precise, and as liberating now as it was in the moment. Jesus first spoke it with the full authority of the awakened pneumatic self. The councils of the early centuries burned texts to prevent you from receiving this understanding. They reframed the encounters of Jesus with unclean frequencies as miracle accounts designed to generate, or rather than replication. They ensured that the word Dakyutha, the frequency declaration that Jesus taught his apostles to speak from the sovereign center of the divine self, was stripped of its context, its charge, and its practical power. That erasure has not survived this moment. You now carry what those councils worked for generations to prevent the understanding that you are not a spiritually contaminated being seeking purity from an external source, but a being of original divine light who has been convinced, through the most sophisticated system of frequency management ever constructed, that the darkness the Archon installed is a permanent feature of your nature. It is not. Dakyutha is the frequency proof. Jesus knew it. His apostles carried it, and now, in this moment, it has found you exactly when it was meant to. Remember to visit my site to get your free Gnostic Awakening Guide. There you will also find my advanced ebooks for those ready to fully break the Archon matrix and step into divine abundance. Everything you need is waiting for you. The link is right below. Get ready. In the next video, I will reveal more sacred Aramaic words that unlock deeper spiritual understanding. Turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Right now, before you close this video, come to the comments and tell us, what did you feel? What shifted? We read every single response. And if this teaching found you today, subscribe to this channel. Every week we go deeper into the ancient frequency codes that were always meant to be yours.